there are stories in Australia that have been dated back, probably we're up to now about 17,000 years of scientifically verifying stories on the change of landscape. Now, 17,000 years, Stonehenge is a mere 5,000. So there are stories that tell of changes in the landscape that happened that long ago. But these stories are accurately retained for that length of time by Australian Aboriginal people, and we know we're going to push them further back. This is very new research because people are only starting to acknowledge the intellectual achievements of non-literate cultures. They keep talking about, wow, they were good at napping stone and hunting and so on. They, nobody's asked, how did they know so much to be able to survive?
Wir alle kennen Stonehenge. Aber über die Bedeutung und den Zweck dieser Ansammlung an Steinen wurde lange spekuliert, ranken sich verschiedenste Mythen. Lange Zeit hatten sich Wissenschaftler Gedanken darüber gemacht, was es denn mit diesem Ort auf sich haben könnte. Lynne Kelly, eine australische Naturwissenschaftlerin, hat ein faszinierendes Buch geschrieben mit dem Titel The Memory Code. Und in diesem Buch vertritt sie die These, dass Stonehenge eigentlich ein riesen Gedächtnispalast war. Ein riesengroßer Merkort, mit dessen Hilfe Kulturen, die keine Schrift besaßen, fähig waren, ihr ganzes Wissen über Generation zu Generation weiter zu tradieren. Auch die großen Monumente von den Osterinseln zum Beispiel fallen laut ihrer Theorie in diese Kategorie. Doch Lynne Kelly konnte ihrer eigenen These anfangs überhaupt nicht trauen. In diesem Rethinking Memory Café Interview erfahren wir, wie aus einer Forscherin, die zuerst an ihrer eigenen These zweifelte, eine erfolgreiche Wissenschaftsautorin wurde. Wir hören davon, wie ihr verschiedene Skeptics Societies, eine Ansammlung von Skeptikern, dabei halfen, ihre These auf Herz und Nieren zu überprüfen und wie sie schlussendlich dazu kam, ihre These zu verfolgen und ein Buch daraus zu schreiben. Wir erfahren weiters, wie die These in der Wissenschaftscommunity aufgenommen wurde und welch großen Anklang sie dort fand. Aber Lynne Kellys Werk ist nicht nur eine Forschungsarbeit über die tiefen und alten Wurzeln nicht nur antiker Merktechniken, sondern eigentlich schon prähistorischer Merktechniken, wenn man so will. Nein, es ist noch viel mehr. Es ist die Reise einer Wissenschaftlerin aus der Vergangenheit in die Gegenwart mit einem schlechten Gedächtnis, die durch ihre Forschungsarbeit zu einer wahren Gedächtnismeisterin wurde. Es ist also beides. Es ist auf der einen Seite eine wissenschaftliche Arbeit, locker geschrieben und total interessant und spannend, die uns Jahrtausende zurückversetzt, die uns zeigt, wie uralt diese effizienten Mnemotechniken doch wirklich sind. Und es ist ein praktischer Ausflug in die praktische Anwendung dieser alten Techniken im 21. Jahrhundert. Wir werden in diesem mehrteiligen Memory Café Interview auch noch das zweite Buch von Lynne Kelly kennenlernen, nämlich das Buch mit dem Titel Memory Craft, das Sequel sozusagen auf Memory Code, wo es darum geht, ganz praktisch diese Techniken verschiedentlich vorgestellt zu bekommen und gezeigt zu bekommen, wie wir sie im 21. Jahrhundert anwenden können. Und ohne weiteres Ausschweifen nun jetzt der erste Teil des Interviews mit Lynne Kelly über das Thema oder das Buch The Memory Code. So Lynne, thank you very much for coming on to the show and to talk about a little bit about your wonderful books you've written on memory. You've written a wonderful book or a fascinating book. It's called The Memory Code, right? And it's about ancient mnemonic techniques. Tell us a little bit, or tell our hearers a little bit about what its main thesis is.
Basically, the idea is that the human race, modern humans, for tens of thousands of years, have been totally dependent on their memories in order to store all the information they had. It's only the last few thousand years we've had writing, and really not even 1,000 years that we've had books. So the human brain has evolved to store memory, and that is a really important way of looking at the past, but also what are we doing about this thing that's natural to our brains?
I see. And so, like your book talks about those ancient cultures, right? Like they used those memory techniques for their everyday life, or to kind of memorize all their knowledge they had. Tell us a little bit, before we start right in, tell us a little bit about where can people find you, and a little bit more about your fascinating publications.
The easiest way to find me is to Google my name, Lynne, Kelly, and you'll get straight to my website, and that's the easiest place to find me. My books are in all bookshops, Amazon Book Depository and all those online shops, as well as real shops.
Mm-hmm. Great. So how did you come to write on such a fascinating topic?
There's a big theory about write about what you know. Mm-hmm. I fail that theory completely. I write about what I don't know. And my big failure all my life has been memory. I've always had a very bad memory, natural memory. And so at school, maths or physics were fine, everything else was hopeless. So when I started looking into the way Indigenous cultures know about animal behaviour and that, I realised it wasn't just the mammals and things. This just happened to be the book I was theoretically going to write. It's never got written. They were memorising vast numbers, hundreds and hundreds of animals, not just the big things like I'm here in Australia, kangaroos and things, mm-hmm. but all the invertebrates and all the reptiles and amphibians and hundreds of animals. And I started saying, but hang on, I can't remember half a dozen of them, and they're naming the lot and telling you all about them. And my thesis, that book, got derailed to a question, how the hell are they doing that? And that started me. I had a scholarship to the La Trobe University here in Victoria in Australia to write a book, and my publisher Alan Unwin wanted it on animal behaviour, and if you looked at that behaviour, knowing about how Indigenous cultures look at the animals, would I see more in the behaviour? Yes, of course I would. It was a lovely one that should market well, and I was given a creative writing scholarship as a science writer, which is a bit weird. The university, the first time they'd done that, so we science people can be creative, and to write that book. And then I derailed the whole thing by these questions, and then derailed it even more by saying, hang on, this explains a whole lot of the monuments and objects from pre-literate or non-literate cultures. Let me get that straight now. Mm-hmm. Pre-literate are cultures before they develop literacy. Illiterate are people that can't write in cultures that have literacy. These memory methods are used by non-literate cultures. The elite of these cultures use these methods, and they are cultures that do not have writing at all. So they have orality, which is the alternative to literacy. Mm-hmm. So I'm very pedantic about using the words non-literate, pre-literate, and illiterate.
I see, understandably. Like the topic you have been describing is very interesting also for a variety of reasons, right? Because on one hand, for example, like for me, I am very interested in mnemonic techniques, and the normal way it's been taught is like that it started like with Simonides of Chaos or Simonides of Cause, or whatever you want to call him, a Greek guy who kind of brought mnemonics into the ancient Greek world, so to say, and from there, it developed as a central or integral part of the rhetorics teaching of the Greeks, right? But what I find so fascinating about your work and your book is you describe that these techniques have been there way longer, like way longer than we ever thought about.
Way longer. Yes, and I happen to be lucky. It was interesting when I was talking to Ros Cleal, we will get to Stonehenge at some stage, but archaeologist at Stonehenge, she said it really had to be an Australian that saw this because we have the oldest continuous culture. That means there are stories in Australia that have been dated back, probably we're up to now about 17,000 years of scientifically verifying stories on the change of landscape. Now, 17,000 years, Stonehenge is a mere 5,000. So there are stories that tell of changes in the landscape that happened that long ago, and mostly more recent, 10,000 years ago at the end of Ice Age and so on. But these stories are accurately retained for that length of time by Australian Aboriginal people, and we know we're going to push them further back. This is very new research because people are only starting to acknowledge the intellectual achievements of non-literate cultures. They keep talking about, wow, they were good at napping stone and hunting and so on. Nobody's asked, how did they know so much to be able to survive? So we know in Australia these methods, and we'll get to the method of loci, the memory palace, what Simonides, however we pronounce him, talked about. In Aboriginal terms, it's called song lines. So these song lines or paths through the landscape go right across the country. There's thousands of kilometres of them. And at every location along them, information is stored in the form of songs. I'm just completing a book now, just went off to the publisher, co-authored with an Aboriginal expert here in Australia on songlines, specifically on these songlines. So the memory palaces of the ancient Greek are a simplified version of what ancient cultures were using. And we've got the same thing in Native American pilgrimage trails. You find it all over the world. The Africans use the same sort of thing, the Pacific ceremonial roads. So these techniques are in non-literate cultures all over the world. But in Australia, we've got them going way, way back because the culture is continuous. It wasn't interfered or interrupted by anyone appearing here and interrupting it.
I see. That's
not static, but continuous.
Pardon? Not
static. It's not unchanging, but it's continuous.
I see. That's very, very interesting. Thank you very much for that insight. You named your book The Memory Code, like the first book you wrote, right? The Memory Code. It's dealing with what you just described, ancient cultures and their mnemonic techniques, and also the significance of like monuments like Stonehenge, which you say might as well just have been huge memory palaces.
Exactly.
Yeah. So for some readers or for some listeners, maybe this may sound a little bit strange. The memory code, it brings up associations with books like, the Bible Code or whatever, where people or authors would speculate about hidden meanings in the Bible. One can only entangle if he reads that specific book, right? So it kind of like brings up associations with very speculative writings, but your book is different, right? So I would ask you these questions: How did scientists react to your thesis when you started, and how did the science community eventually receive your final book?
Scientists have been wrapped in everything I say because I use scientific method. My background is, my first degree is engineering. My master's, I've got postgrad in computing. It really is an information systems theory. These memory palaces are memory devices. It's just the data's all in memory. So we're just getting the structure and not the data. So they're variable length memory. What do you call them? My brain stopped. Databases.
Okay.
Database. It's not old age, it's just me. So they're variable length databases without the actual data, because that's all stored in memory. So because I'm very rigorous in using memory in scientific techniques, there has been no problem with the scientific community at all. In fact, if you've got a radical theory, your best friends in the world are the skeptics. So I'm a foundation member of the Australian Skeptics, but I'm also involved with American and British. So when I got this crazy idea about that Stonehenge was a memory palace, and there's a lot of evidence to go with that, not just some big stones, I didn't believe it myself. For the first 10 minutes, I was wildly excited. And then I decided, this is ridiculous. If you've thought of this, why hadn't somebody else? So I went to the Victorian Skeptics and said, I've got this crazy idea. I've got a PhD thesis I'm supposed to be doing, and I can't stop thinking about this. This is what I'm going to argue. Can you please knock it down so I can get back to work? And so I gave them all my arguments in advance so they could do the research, and some of them really put some effort in. And we had that debate, and they gave me all the questions. They polished my theory. The Australian Skeptics and Victorian Skeptics, I did 5 different presentations to them as it developed, and they knocked it as hard as they could, and in the end, I had no knockers left. So skeptics, these scientific people, are really good at asking the hard questions and forcing you to be scientific about it. So I used them. And lots of scientific people, I had no problem whatsoever. But that's because that's the language I speak.
That's great. It's a funny and great approach. It's lovely.
Very useful people. Exploit them.
Exploit them.
Well, the Fortean Society in England, I spoke to them when Memory Code first came out, and they've just asked me to do some more. And they had people that were really ready to have a go at me. Which is what I asked for. And they ended up loving it too, and they're less extreme, hardcore skeptic. So these organisations are very useful and stacked full of scientists.
That's great. So tell us a little bit about how did you conduct your research after that skeptic onslaught, so to say, and your survival of it, right? How then did you go about conducting your research, and what were your findings?
Well, for the first 3 years of it, I still didn't believe it. Self-doubt almost destroyed me. So I kept both topics going. But basically, I needed to understand Indigenous memory systems. My background's all maths and physics and things, no sociology, no anthropology, no archaeology. My husband was doing an archaeology degree, which he then completed. But so what I did was started talking to Indigenous cultures, asking, how the hell do you remember so much stuff? And I did it using the university ethics committees, going through the correct organisations. The university then funded me a trip to America. So I was working with Australian Aboriginal here and the research, and they sent me to America so I could work with American Pueblo. The Pueblo people are the most useful in the southwest of the United States because they weren't kicked off their land. All the other cultures were sort of moved into reservations or destroyed by the invaders, whereas the Pueblo managed to fight back and survive on their land. So they've got the strongest link to the landscape, to their memory palaces, which was useful. So it was a matter of talking and listening and then trying out what they were telling me. And now I've lost track of what question I'm supposed to be answering, but that's never going to worry me. So I did that research. Eventually, though, I was keeping 2 thesis going. So the university librarian decided to test my theory by taking research that I knew nothing about that she found and testing it against my theory. And she became a great convert very quickly. Academic librarians, they're as useful as skeptics are. They really are, because they know how to test and research things. In the end, my husband said, we can't afford a psychiatrist, you're going nuts, because I really was, the self-doubt was just about destroying me. So we contacted Ros Cleal at Stonehenge, went across to England, sat down with her, the only time I have been physically sick before a meeting. But she allowed me 1 hour. She gets Stonehenge nutters all the time. But because I came from a university, she had to grant this Stonehenge nutter an hour. She had a minder with her. to get rid of me. And at the end of 4 hours, she does this. This is doing my head in, and got me to come back the next day. At the end of 2 days, going right through it thoroughly, she said, this theory is well worth pursuing, and it is original.
Wow.
So that's when I decided to drop the other one and go for it. Being old, I've got an advantage over PhD students who want an academic career because I don't fit anywhere now.
I see.
I couldn't have gone on in an academic career. I could take those risks. There's huge advantages in being old. So then I just went for it, and I kept throwing the theory at Aboriginal people, at all sorts of different people to try and get them to knock it down, because those gave me the questions, so there were no loopholes left.
That's awesome, really. And also, and also, your experience is also interesting to me. Like you gave all your heart and energy to it, but at the same time, you were like, really like, is this gonna work? Like, am I just crazy or whatever? You know, it's just the struggle you have.
In my thesis, because I was confident of all the Indigenous memory stuff, I did the thesis in 2 parts, the Indigenous memory stuff and then the application to archaeology. And it's not just Stonehenge, it was Easter Island and Chaco Canyon and particular places around the world. And I did that as the second part, so that if it failed, I could ditch the archaeology and just go for the Indigenous memory systems. Then my supervisor gave me the choice. Do you go for the hard examiners, the really hardcore archaeologists who do not like an outsider coming in when you've got no background in archaeology, or do you go for safe examiners that you've got a better chance of passing? Now, if I was young, it would have been safe. I'm not young. I said go for the hardest, because their names, if they agree to it and pass it, that credibility and authority is mine for life. And so that's what we did. Very nerve-wracking and scary thing. Looking back, I don't know if I'd have the guts to say that again, but it worked.
Great.
So then when I submitted the thesis to Cambridge University Press for publication, I got an answer within less than 12 hours saying, yes, we're interested.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that was some kind of joke. I didn't believe it, but it was published by Cambridge University Press.
It's awesome.
And it's those names of those examiners that covered it. They wouldn't have even looked at it without those names.
I see. Yeah. So how many places did you then visit, and to which indigenous? I always pronounce that word wrong because I'm not a native speaker. Indigenous, yeah. Right? I also say things like similar, which a friend of mine makes fun of me because you say similar, like familiar, and similar. I always say that wrong.
Similar.
Yeah, right. Similar, yeah.
Fun.
Pardon?
This is fun.
Yeah. So how many places did you visit, and which indigenous people groups did you speak with, and what did they tell you?
Okay, there's 2 sections to this: the indigenous and then applying it to the archaeology. So for the indigenous, I'm on Dja country. I live on, and I'm here now, so I should be acknowledging the elders of the country I live on. So they were invaluable. Plus, Latrobe worked with particular Aboriginal people helping with the archaeology. In particular, Daryl Pappen, who's Muti Muti, he was very helpful. But the important thing with ethics committees of the university, you do not just trot off into Aboriginal communities and start asking them the same questions they've been asked 4,000 times. They are not lab rats. They are humans living normal lives. So there are Indigenous organisations, the Koori Heritage Trust here in Victoria. So I approached those organisations, and they basically said to me, we will recommend the research. If there's any questions that the existing research that we recommend, and that's people that have worked closely with Aboriginal people and they agree with, if anything I want to know isn't in that research, then we can start visiting communities. And what I wanted was all there. It's not new. It hadn't been put together my way. The same with Pueblo in America. I visited the Pueblo Indian Center in Albuquerque, and I got the same thing everywhere. These are the people that we have worked with. So I only used research of people that had been living with Indigenous cultures and in most cases initiated to at least one degree with them, or given a name, as it is in Australia, given a name within the culture in Africa, Pacific, America and Australia. So those research techniques, which are the university techniques, worked very well for me.
Great. And
so the archaeology places, do you want them too?
Yeah.
We'll get to that later.
Yeah, we'll get to that in like 2 questions or something. So you talked about Aboriginal people and about their use of songlines as mnemonic devices. And you also talked to them about it, right?
Absolutely.
What evidence, other than, let's say, personal testimony, is there that points into the direction of those monuments that they were indeed huge memory palaces?
Right. I'm going to give you my technical stuff now because as a scientist, it's important that I have a set of criteria that can be falsified. That's the basis of science theory. So as a result of working with the Indigenous cultures, and even though I glimpsed this was Stonehenge and so on fairly early on, I couldn't go down there till I'd set the set of criteria. And I found that there were 10 indicators that a ceremonial space or that a monument within an Indigenous culture was used for memory, for knowledge transfer. The first is that there needs to be no stratification within the society. So non-literate cultures are egalitarian in everything except knowledge, but they share everything. So as soon as you get burials with particular wealth goods, you're through this stage, you've got into a much bigger society where memory will be split up between specialists. We can go on for ages for that. But the work I'm doing on these memory techniques are a stratified society with no individual wealth. And all these monuments around the world, Stonehenge has burials, but they're later, not at the very beginning, with individual wealth. They might have burials, but not with wealth goods. Number 2 is that they have public and restricted ceremonial sites. So there has to be a sign of restriction. Now, if you're going to keep knowledge accurate for 7,000, 10,000 years, Chinese whispers effect get rid of accuracy in 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Ridiculously long. And the reason it works is that they keep knowledge restricted. So the stuff that we hear, the children's stories that you get, the sung of little stories, they are just the foundation stories and they can be varied. But the information about all the animals and plants and trade agreements and genealogies and all that are kept restricted. Secret business, it's called here.
Oh, okay.
And that's because you've got to avoid the Chinese whispers effect. So when you're initiated into that information, it is kept absolutely careful and you're not allowed to use it, art designs, all those things, until you're granted permission because you've got it accurate. And that's how they manage to keep it accurate. So there must be a sign of public and restricted. All of these are at Stonehenge. An idea of labour for no apparent utilitarian use. I do get sick of this constant non-utilitarian objects and things, and I will get to objects in a moment. They did not spend 1 million work hours building Stonehenge for no utility or just for worshipping gods or whatever. By the way, Indigenous cultures don't tend to have gods. They will have characters and that, but they're not gods that they worship. So labour, there is a utilitarian use, it's knowledge. And that's what hasn't been acknowledged. That there needs to be an order, a distinct order for the memory palace. If I find a single stone arrangement from the Neolithic or post arrangement that does not have a clear order to it, that they're random, then the theory falls apart. And I've looked at 1,000 of them and there's not one, and I've never found one. So I had to have falsifiable stuff in there. Decorated objects we're going to get to, because once you start me on those, I won't shut up. But they're called enigmatic decorated objects, and Indigenous cultures all use them. I'm holding things. Here's an example, the one we'll get to, the African Lakasa. Mm-hmm. All cultures use handheld objects as memory devices, so they need to be in the archaeology, and they are. An imbalance of trade, because knowledge is traded. So you'll get places, in particular, say, Poverty Point in Louisiana was one of the main ones, that goods are coming in, but we can't see what's going out. That's because they're knowledge centres. Ceremonial centres are knowledge centres. So they're trading, just like a university does. Mm-hmm. They're trading goods for money. There had to be astronomical alignments, because you can't retain a ceremonial cycle and a calendar for all the stuff without them. It needs to reference the landscape, because that's part of memory palaces. Acoustic enhancement is hugely important in ceremonial stuff to make it memorable. And rock art, if you happen to be in the right place, art is a major memory device. So I had these 10 very clearly specified and falsifiable criteria. I expected 9 or at worst 8. Some places you can't have rock art because there aren't rocks. Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for this very thorough and yet fast introduction in your scientific approach. It's really, really very interesting.
If you don't approach it like that, it's just a waffly theory.
Pardon me?
If you don't approach it with a set of very specific criteria, you've got a waffly theory.
Right.
And the science people would never accept that.
I see. Mm-hmm. So, like you said, monuments like Stonehenge or the Easter Island statues, they were memory palaces. So that's a very interesting idea, or a very interesting theory. And you've also given us the meat now. You've kind of laid out what the scientific criteria are to show that they actually are memory palaces. So honing in or focusing in on the particulars of how to use such a big place as a memory palace would be very interesting, like for our listeners as well, because I would imagine, like, also for me, it's like, we use memory palaces for learning things, and we kind of are used to our homes to use or roots outside of our homes and whatever. But like how in the world, if I picture Stonehenge just for a little moment, like how in the world are huge piles of rocks, so to say, are being used specifically as a memory palace? In der nächsten Episode geht's weiter mit dem zweiten Teil des Memory Café Interviews mit Lynne Kelly über das Buch The Memory Code. In diesem zweiten Teil wird's noch spannender. Jetzt bewegen wir uns von der wissenschaftlichen Materie in die Praxis. Wir schauen uns an, wie diese Techniken funktionieren und lernen trotzdem noch etwas über den Hintergrund dieser faszinierenden, Jahrtausenden alten Techniken kennen. Im Teil 3 und Teil 4 dieses Interviews mit Lynne Kelly wird dann ihr Buch Memory Craft vorgestellt, und dort sprechen wir ganz besonders über die Anwendung dieser Merktechniken im 21. Jahrhundert, ganz besonders auf das Schulsetting. Also wenn du zum Beispiel ein Lehrer bist oder selbst gerade in der Schule, hier spricht Lynne Kelly über ihre reichhaltige Erfahrung in der Anwendung mit diesen alten Merktechniken im Schulsetting. Das solltest du auf jeden Fall auch nicht verpassen. Wenn du Interesse an den Büchern von Lynne Kelly gefunden hast, dann klicke einfach auf die Episodenbeschreibung. Dort findest du Links zu den einzelnen Büchern The Memory Code und Memory Craft. Ankündigungen spannender Interviews mit spannenden Interviewpartnern findest du übrigens immer auf Instagram und auch auf Facebook. Du kannst uns einfach auf Instagram, Facebook und YouTube folgen. Die Links dazu findest du unten in der Description. So bleibst du immer am Laufenden und verpasst keines dieser spannenden Interviews. Außerdem sicherst du dir so die Chance, beim nächsten Gewinnspiel mit dabei zu sein und Coaching mit mir zu gewinnen.